everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare, and today I have another knitting tutorial for you. So what I'm going to be showing you today is step-by-step how to knit a cardigan sweater. So here I have a pink version. In this video I'll be knitting the green version, green-blue here, and I'll be taking you through each of the steps that you need to create this. Now, a sweater tutorial is probably my most requested video tutorial up until this point, and I spent almost all of this summer just developing this pattern and making sure that it was the best that it could be. And I wanted to make sure that this pattern could fit any range of sizes that people wanted to knit it in. So what it is it's actually a pattern recipe. So what that means is we're going to start off by just taking a few measurements of ourselves. So things like, how long do you want the sleeves? How long do you want the sweater? What is your bust circumference? And once you take your own measurements, we're going to do a few simple calculations to take those measurements and determine how many stitches you need. So things like how many stitches you need, how many decreases you need to work. And each one of those calculations I'll take you through, and I'll guide you through how to use the pattern. So a few features of the pattern. It is knit flat, so we're actually going to start off knitting each one of the panels. So we start with the back panel there. Then we're going to work each one of these front panels. Last up, the sleeves. We're going to seam it all together. Then last up, we're going to work this neckband, where we leave a few buttonholes so you can sew on cute buttons that really complement the sweater. It can be knit in two different colors if you'd like. So shown here, we have like a pink solid and then more of like a variegated yarn. Same thing here, two colors. Or you can knit it all in one color if you prefer. It is knit as a V-neck sweater, and the one dimension that you can't alter in the sweater is the depth of this V-neck here. So it's a 9-inch drop in the front. So just to keep the pattern calculations a little bit easy, that stays the same across any size you're going to knit it in. A few things to note. First up, down in the description box below, you're going to find each one of the video breakpoints. That way you can fast forward or rewind any specific portion of this video that you're looking for. You're also going to find the link to the PDF version of this pattern, which is available on my website. So the link will take you to my website, and then there should be a big PDF pattern button on that page. Click on that. That'll take you to the document where you can download it, print it, whatever you'd like to do with the document. That way you can follow along with all the measurements and calculations that we're doing in the video. Also, this video was highly requested, and I'm always looking for new requests for videos. So if there's any videos you'd like to see in the future, please leave those in the comments down below as well. Also, I wanted to mention, if you've been enjoying my tutorials, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up. If you think someone would be interested in this tutorial, be sure to share the video down below. And also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel as well. It really helps me build and grow my audience. So now that I've gone over the basics and the overview of the sweater we're going to be knitting, let's get started.
We're going to start off by looking at all the measurements we need to take in order to knit this custom sweater. So in this first portion of the pattern, you're going to see that I've written out the exact measurements you want to take of yourself, and we're going to be filling in each one of these as I describe them. Starting off, we're trying to figure out the length of a sweater we would like. So where you want to measure from is essentially the top center of your shoulder down to wherever you'd like your sweater to end. Between those two, in inches, that's going to be A, and you're going to fill in that inch length right there. Next up, we want to figure out the circumference of a sweater that we need, and this sweater has a bit of positive ease. So what that means is it won't hang directly next to the body, there'll be a bit of extra fabric. So you want to measure your bust circumference, and then to that bust circumference, you're going to add on 6 inches. That's our positive ease. So bust circumference plus 6 inches, then fill that in as your B value. The next 3 are all about the sleeves. So first, thinking about a sleeve length, the way you're going to measure your sleeve length is going from the center of your neck, and then you want to go down to wherever you'd like your sleeve to end. Between those two, you're going to fill that in as your C value. And you want to make sure your arm is stretched all the way straight when you're taking that measurement. Lastly, we have our 2 arm circumference measurements. So first we're going to do the top of our arm, the circumference around it, and then we're going to add on 4 inches. That will be our J measurement. Then you want to measure the bottom of your arm around your wrist and add on 2 inches. That will be our K measurement. Down there at the bottom too. Once you've taken all of those measurements, you're all ready to begin working the pattern and filling in each one of these components. So now in the front panel and the back panels, right, you're going to need things like the total desired length, right, and the circumference. So you're going to fill in anywhere it says A, you're going to fill in this A value that you just put in your table. First, starting off with my yarn, I am using Lion brand Wool Ease for my sweater. And if you're looking for a comparable weight of yarn, this one is a super bulky size 6. And you want to look for something that recommends a US size 13 knitting needle, which is 9 millimeters. Now I will be knitting mine out of 2 colors. So the main fabric of the sweater is going to be this one. They're like a bit of a self-striping yarn kind of. It's just a little bit variegated. So this colorway is called Sea Glass. And then the contrast color, which I'll use for all the ribbing on the cuff and the bottom of the sweater and around the neckline, it's going to be this solid color. And this one is called Succulent. In the pattern, I'll include a calculation that you can do to figure out how many balls of yarn you'll need. And of course, if you want to, you can just knit the sweater out of just one color. You don't have to do the contrasting color either. But I will note where I'll be switching my yarn between the two. Next up, in terms of the knitting needles, I'm using a size US 13 knitting needle, exactly the one that the yarn is recommending. And you do want a long cord, so I recommend 40 inches or longer. The sweater is knit flat, but the reason for the long cord is that for the neckline, we actually have to go all the way along the full sweater, so go up one side and down the other side and pick up all the stitches at one time. So in order to hold all those stitches, you need a long cord. So that's the reason I'm knitting flat, but on a circular knitting needle. A few of the other materials you're going to need for this project include 4 buttons, and I recommend looking for diameters between 1 1/8 inches to 1.5 inches. A large tapestry needle, and I'll link my favorite ones to use, which are the clover ones, down below. Pair of scissors. And then you're also going to want a fabric tape measure. This comes in handy both when you're taking your measurements and also as you're measuring your project as we work along. Before you begin the yarn calculations, you want to make sure you've taken all of your measurements already. So make sure you have the table above the yarn calculations table already filled in. So things like your A, your B value, all of those. The way it works is I have it split up into 2 different sections. So there is a border color section and then a main fabric color. If you want to knit the sweater all in one color, all you're going to do is calculate each one of these values separately and then add them together. The way it's written here, it's split up just in case someone does want to knit it the way I have shown in the video with the 2 separate colors. Starting with the border color, what you want to do first is calculate this portion in parentheses. So I'm going to do 2 times my A value, where my A value was that top of shoulder to my desired length, plus 2 times my K value, where my K value I measured as my wrist circumference plus 2 inches. And then lastly, I'm going to add on my B value, where I found that B value to be my bust circumference plus 6 inches. Once I've done that portion in parentheses, I'm going to multiply it by 0.5, and that's going to give me the number of yards I need in the solid color yarn, or the border color. Now for the main fabric color, we have to do 2 intermediate calculations before we can actually do our yardage calculation. So starting with the sleeve length, we want to take our C value. So our C value was the center of the neck to our wrist, and we're going to subtract off our B value divided by 4. Our B value again was that bust circumference where we added in 6 inches. And then we're going to subtract off 2. And you just want to write that value right there on the line. We'll use it in just a moment. Then next up we have the average sleeve circumference. So for the average sleeve circumference, we're going to take the top of the arm measurement, which was our J, where we added on 3 inches, plus our K, which again, that was our wrist circumference, plus 2 inches. We're going to average them, so we're going to divide them by 2, and then put that value right on the line. Now that we have those two values, we're all ready to begin our equation down here. So first up, we're going to do A times B. So this is essentially thinking about like the main body portion of the sweater. So we have the length times the circumference. And then next up, we have the sleeves essentially. So we have 2 sleeves times the sleeve length, which is the value that we just calculated up above. And then times the average sleeve circumference, which that one is our other value we calculated above. Once we add the 2 portions together, so the A times B plus the 2 times those sleeve measurements, we're going to multiply the whole thing by 0.5, and then that will give us our number of yards for the main fabric color.
Now first up, I'm going to knit a gauge swatch. And for my gauge swatch, I'm going to knit a bit of ribbing and then the garter stitch after that. So I will be using both of my colorways. To start off, we're going to cast on using our ribbing colorway or your main color yarn if you only have one color. And I want to cast on using the same cast on method I'm going to be using for the project. So the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. The cast on I'm going to be showing you here is the long tail cast on. Also, I wanted to mention real quick, if you're curious about a comparison video between the long tail cast on and the German twisted cast on, I do have a video of that, which I can link in the upper corner. So this cast on, the way it works is you cast on with the main yarn and also with the tail. So you do need a fairly long tail to start off, and it's a bit of trial and error, so I always just do a little bit extra here. And I'm just gonna grab onto my yarn once I've pulled off a bit to cast on with my left hand, and I'm gonna create a slip knot first. The way I create a slip knot is I grab onto the yarn with my bottom 3 fingers. Again, the working yarn is further away from me, the tail of yarn is closest to me. I'm gonna take my working yarn and I'm gonna go up above my pointer finger of my left hand, down to the bottom, up the front to the top, down below to the bottom, then one more time, up the top to the front, down below to the bottom. And I'm gonna grab onto the strand with my bottom 3 fingers as well. Now the way I create a slip knot is I'm just gonna rearrange these top 2 loops. So I'm gonna take the second loop, move it up closer to the top of my pointer finger so it becomes the new first loop. I'm gonna take this second loop, move it up closer to the top of my finger, and now take that newest second loop, slide it off of my finger, and I've created a slip knot. Now I'm gonna hold that slip knot, the tail closest to me, working yarn furthest away, and I'm just gonna take either one of my knitting needle points and slide it on to the slip knot, going from right towards the left. Then I gently pull on the tail to tighten it on my knitting needle. Okay, so to begin the cast on, I'm gonna hold this knitting needle, so the one with the slip knot in it, in my right hand. Just gonna grab right onto it, and I do usually hold the slip knot with my pointer finger of that right hand just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Now with my left hand, I'm gonna grab onto both of the strands of yarn with my bottom 3 fingers. And now what I wanna do is I wanna take my pointer finger of my left hand and I'm gonna push away from myself on the top strand, which is the working yarn. Then I'm gonna push towards myself with my thumb on the bottom strand, or the strand closest to me, and that strand of yarn is the tail. Now next up, we're gonna take our palm and point our palm up towards the ceiling. So this is currently what my yarn looks like. And to work the cast on, I'm gonna take my knitting needle towards myself, up the center of my thumb, back to my pointer finger, down the center of my pointer finger, grab onto that yarn around my pointer finger, then pull that yarn back down my thumb, release with my thumb, push back on that strand of yarn with my thumb. So it's a bit of a complicated cast on, but don't worry, I'm going to show it a whole bunch more times, nice and slow. Again, my palm is up towards the ceiling. I'm going to go up the center of my thumb, back to my pointer finger, down the center of my pointer finger. So I'm basically grabbing onto that one strand of yarn around my pointer finger. Bring it back over to my thumb, go down my thumb, let go of the yarn with my thumb, push back on the second strand of yarn or that tail strand with my thumb. Again, I'm going to point my palm up towards the ceiling and repeat again. Up my thumb, down my pointer finger, bring that strand of yarn back down my thumb. Release, push back on that tail strand. You pull some more yarn off over here. And if you ever accidentally let go, all you have to do is grab onto it again with your left hand, push away from yourself on the working yarn with your pointer finger, push towards yourself on the tail with your thumb, palm up towards the ceiling, up your thumb, back to your pointer finger, pull the loop down your thumb. Let go with your thumb, push back on that tail. I'm just going to keep on repeating this until I've cast on the 16 stitches for my gauge swatch. Okay, so now I have my 16 stitches. Let me just double count to make sure. Perfect. So now I'm going to start working the ribbing of my gauge swatch. So for the ribbing row, I'm just working knit one, purl one all the way across, and I'm going to keep on repeating that row over and over again until it measures just about 3 inches. So knit one, bring the yarn to the front, purl one. Repeat again, bring the yarn to the back, knit one, yarn to the front, purl one. And turn my work the exact same row again. I just finished the ribbing portion of the swatch, so now I'm going to cut that yarn, just leaving a short tail. And if you are just working in one color, no need to cut your yarn, just continue on the next portion in the same color. But I'm going to join in my garter stitch color here just to see what they look like together. And now I'm going to work that garter row, which is just knitting on both sides of the work over and over again for a total of 5 inches additional. So when I join in the new color, I'm just going to go right into that first stitch to knit, but instead of wrapping my previous yarn around the knitting needle, I'm just going to take a bit of my yarn here, wrap it over, leave about an 8-inch tail there, lay it over the knitting needle, and pull that new yarn through as if I was knitting with that. So knit all the way across the row. And now turn my work and knit all the way across this side. And that is all the garter stitch is you knit row after row. So I just finished those additional 5 inches of the garter stitch, and last up I'm just going to cast off my swatch. So I'm going to use the same cast off that I'll use in the actual sweater pattern. So the way it works is you knit the first stitch,
Then you knit the next stitch. And now I want to take the previous stitch on my right knitting needle and I'm going to slide it up, over, and off this second stitch. So the way I do this is I slide them up close to the top of my knitting needle. I take my left knitting needle, going from left to right, pick up the one that's closer to my right hand. Now go up, over, and off the other stitch that's on my right knitting needle. Now that's kind of like the setup, and now the repeat begins. So the repeat is knit one, take the previous stitch, up, over, and off. And then again, knit one, take the previous stitch, up, over, and off. And I'm going to keep on doing this all the way along this top edge. Now once I reach the end of the stitches on my left knitting needle, I'm going to cast off that last one I can on the right knitting needle, and then I'm just going to pull on that last remaining stitch to make it larger. Slide it off my knitting needle. I cut my yarn, and for just the swatch I just leave a short tail here. And then I thread the tail through that last stitch and tighten. Now the last step here before we measure it is I'm going to soak it and let it dry. So I soak my swatch in a bowl of kind of like lukewarm room temperature water. To get all the water out after about like 15 minutes of soaking, I take my swatch out, I gently squeeze it, and then I roll it up in a dry towel to try and get a lot of the excess moisture out. Then I just lay it flat. So I'm going to do all those steps to this swatch, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to measure the stitches. Now that our swatch is all washed and dried, what we're going to do is we're going to measure the swatch and make sure it matches the gauge in the pattern. So there's two different dimensions. There's going to be rows and then stitches. So let's start with stitches. The pattern says 6.75 stitches equals 3 inches. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to line it up with one of these rows going across. And I like to start it just before one of these kind of like rainbow curves. So you'll see it's right in between the two of them. And now I'm going to see how many of these full curves are in 3 inches. So let me find something to point with here. I'll use this. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then almost all of that 7th one, right? It's just a little short there. So this would give me the 6.75 stitches equals 3 inches. Next up, let's do the row gauge. So what I want to do now is I'm going to measure up and down, and I'm going to line my ruler up. I'm going to start it off in between, as close to in between as I can get, between two of these sets of bumps. And now I'm going to count how many sets of bumps are in 3 inches. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and just about a half there. Now, that seems contrary to what we have in the pattern. The key here is that each one of these sets of bumps is actually 2 rows. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then half of this one, so 13 rows in 3 inches. And again, if you had too many or too few, you would want to consider going up or down a knitting needle size. Once your gauge matches, we're all ready to begin knitting and calculating for our full pattern. Before we begin working the back panel, let's go through the calculations and measurements that we need. So for the back panel, there's 3 values we want to calculate, D, E, and F. And there's 2 measurements that we need from our original table. We need the length that we measured, which was A, and then we need that bust circumference plus 6 inches, which is our B. So first, let's calculate this D value. So for D, we want to take our bust circumference plus the 6 inches, or B, divide it by 2, and then multiply it by 2.25. Now your answer will likely end up being something with decimal places, so you want to take whatever your answer is, and you want to round it up to the nearest number divisible by 2. Once you get that final answer, you're going to fill it in right there. So an example would be, I'm just picking a random number here, maybe you ended up with 40.75 as your answer. What you're going to want to do is take that and round it up to the nearest number divisible by 2. So I would round it up to 42 and then fill in 42 right there. Next up, we're going to be taking a length. So the length of the sweater that we measured back in our original measurements, A, and we're going to subtract off 3 inches, fill in that value, and that'll be our E number. And last up, we need to basically figure out a number of stitches along the top that we want to work before a cast off. So this is going to be our D number, which we got right up there. We're going to subtract off 16 and then divide it by 2. And you want to make sure this D number that you're using down here, you've already rounded it up to the nearest number divisible by 2. That way this calculation will work out nicely. Now that we've done all the calculations for the back panel, what we're going to start with is this panel is cast on from the bottom, then worked up through the top and the neckline. So starting off with the ribbing, I'm going to use the ribbing color yarn. So this contrast color. So first up, I'm going to be casting on the number of stitches we just calculated, which was D stitches. And I'm going to cast them on using the long tail cast on, which is the same cast on method that I used while knitting that gauge swatch. And this cast on, it needs a long tail because essentially you're casting on with the working yarn and the tail at the same time. So I always like to overestimate and just go with way too much yarn because I find it's easier just to have too much extra than to not have enough. So I'm just going to unravel a whole bunch of yarn here. Okay, I'm going to say that'll be enough. And now I'm going to start my cast on, and I'm going to cast on again that D number of stitches that we just calculated. Now that I've finished that cast on, I'm going to take my yarn tail here where I had way too much extra, and I'm just going to tie it up just so it stays out of the way as I'm knitting along. I always like to leave the tail here just in case I have to take out my work and start over again. That way I don't lose any of the yarn. Okay, perfect. So now I'm going to start that ribbing row repeat. So just like in the swatch, our ribbing row is going to be alternating between knit 1, then purl 1. And I'm going to go all the way across, repeating those 2 stitches. Now I'm going to turn my work. Now I'm just going to continue repeating this ribbing row over and over again, a total of 6 times. If you do want to switch your ribbing to be either wider or thinner, that's going to be the number you're going to want to modify. Now I just finished those 6 rows of ribbing, and now I've turned my work to begin the next row. So the thing I want to do before I switch yarn colors or keep the same color and start working the garter stitch is I'm going to mark this as the front of my work. So I choose this side as the front of my work because I like the way the cast on edge looks more on this side than it does on this side. So the way I'm just gonna mark the front of my work is you can use a stitch marker. In my case, I tend to lose stitch markers a lot, so I'm just gonna take a piece of yarn and tie it onto this front side of my work, also called the right side, abbreviated as RS in the pattern. Just gently tie that on there so I know this is the right side. The opposite side is the wrong side, abbreviated WS in the pattern. So now I'm all done with this color. If you're only working with one color, don't cut your yarn. You'll just keep on going for the next step. I leave a fairly short tail, probably about 10 inches there. And now I'm gonna begin the garter pattern. So the garter pattern, just like on the swatch, all we do is we knit row after row. So I'm gonna join my new color. So instead of working with my previous color and knitting, I'm just gonna take a tail. I do actually like to leave a fairly long tail, that way I can use this for seaming later on. So I'm probably gonna leave about a 20-inch tail. That might even be, that's probably closer to almost 30 inches there. Loop that around my knitting needle and pull it through. And now I'm just gonna begin knitting with that yarn from my ball of yarn. Once I get a few stitches in, I'm gonna tie this yarn tail that's very long up out of the way so I don't accidentally start knitting with it at any point. And again, working that garter row, which is just knitting. So you knit on the right side and you knit across the wrong side of your work. And we're gonna keep on working that garter row over and over again until the full length measures the E number that you've calculated for your pattern. Now I just ran out of one ball of yarn, so I just wanted to show real quick how I join a new one. All I'm gonna do is usually I try and make sure I'm at least a few stitches into a row. I don't like to switch balls of yarn as much along the side. So I'm in the middle of a row. Doesn't matter which side of your work. I'm gonna take my new ball of yarn. I probably go about 10 inches in, 8 to 10 inches there, create a loop. And now I'm just gonna go into the next stitch as if to knit, but instead of knitting with that previous yarn ball, I just take my new one, wrap it around the knitting needle and pull through. And now I'm gonna continue working with that new strand of yarn. So what I'm gonna be left with, let me get down a few stitches here, just so I don't lose any of the stitches, is I just have 2 yarn tails hanging off my work. So at the very end, when I weave in my ends, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make sure they're on the wrong side of my work, which these ones already are. If they aren't, I can always thread them through. I'm gonna tie a knot and then I weave them in opposite directions. Now I finished that whole center portion of the back and I am about to work a right side row. So the right side of my work is facing up for the row I'm about to work across. And what we're gonna be doing in this row is we're gonna knit a set of stitches, cast off 16 stitches in the center of our row, and then we're gonna knit the remaining stitches. So you're gonna end up with equal portions on either side of the 16 we cast off in the middle. So first we need one of the numbers that we calculated, so we need that F number. So I'm gonna start off by knitting that F number of stitches. Now next up, I'm gonna begin the cast off of the 16 stitches. So you essentially want to pretend like you're about to start casting off an edge just in the middle of your work. So first up, I'm gonna knit 1 stitch, then I'm gonna knit a 2nd stitch, and those are both of that center portion. Now I'm gonna pass the previous stitch up, over, and off the existing stitch. Now the repeat begins. So I'm gonna knit the next stitch from the left-hand knitting needle, pass the previous stitch up, over, and off. Now you can see the gap starting to form, right? So we're casting off stitches and it's gonna keep on going this way. Before you get too far, what I'd recommend is counting over here on the right hand side to make sure you still have that F number of stitches. So I still do. If you don't, it's likely a mistake where you didn't knit 2 and then start the cast off. So you want to go back and make sure you're starting basically a new cast off right once you finish that F number of stitches. So now I'm going to continue working across. So far I've cast off 2 stitches. Now I'm going to knit the next stitch, slide the previous up, over, and off. Cast off 3, knit the next, slide the previous up, over, and off. Now I'm up to 4. So I'm going to keep on going until I've cast off 16. Now I've just finished the 16, and when I finish, I will still have the 1 remaining stitch over here on my right hand knitting needle. Now you can double check that you've cast off the right number of stitches, because now if I count across the remaining stitches and the 1 stitch over here on my right hand knitting needle, I should again have F stitches. And I do, so that's perfect. So now I'm going to continue knitting across the rest of this row. Now I turned my work, and what I'm going to be working next is this left back decrease is what the portion of the pattern is called. So it's called the left back because if I look at the right side of my work, can't quite zoom out any further than that, but when I have the right side of my work facing up, this is the upper left. So just showing one of the decrease rows here. So I'll work left back, decrease row 1. This one again is worked on the wrong side of the work, which I'm currently looking at. I'm going to knit until 4 stitches remain. So 4 stitches remain in just this left back portion. Now I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So to work a knit 2 together, I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the front base of the next 2 stitches on my left knitting needle, going from left over towards the right, as if you were going to knit 1 stitch, but now you're just going through both of the stitches at one time. Wrap your yarn around, pull through both of the stitches and slide them off. And now I'm going to knit the final 2 stitches. Now I don't have to do anything with these other stitches over here on the other side. I'm just going to turn my work and I'm going to continue working these exact same stitches. So the next row here, the left back decrease, row 2, on the right side of my work, which I'm currently looking at, just says to knit across. So I'm going to knit across these stitches. Now again, I'm going to turn my work and I'm ready to begin the left back decrease row 3 across the wrong side. So I'm going to work rows 3, 4, and 5, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to cast off for row 6. I'm now on that row 6, so I have the right side of my work facing up, and I'm going to cast off along this top edge. So I'm going to use the same cast off that I used for the middle of the row. So first up, I'm going to knit the first stitch, then I'm going to knit the second stitch. Now I'm going to press the previous stitch on my right knitting needle up, over, and off the second stitch. Now the repeat begins, so I'm going to knit 1 more stitch from my left knitting needle, take the previous stitch on my right knitting needle, slide it up, over, and off. Repeat again, knit 1, slide the previous stitch, up, over, and off. And I'm just going to continue this all the way along the top edge. When I finish, I'm just going to have the 1 stitch remaining over here on my right knitting needle. I pull on that stitch to make it a larger loop, take out my knitting needle, and now I'm going to cut my yarn. And I do leave a longer tail here, probably about 24 inches, just so I could use this tail to seam along the top if I want to. In just about all of my cast offs and cast ons, I try to leave long tails for the sweater just so that I can potentially use the yarn and it's already attached. I don't have to add on a new piece. So that is the left back. Now we're going to work on the right back. So first up, I need the wrong side of my work facing up. So I have that. And now I'm going to thread my knitting needle back through so that my knitting needle is back on my stitches and the knitting needle point is going over towards the right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rejoin my yarn and I'm going to work across this first row. So first up, for the right back decrease row 1, we're going to knit the first 2 stitches. So I'm just going to go into that first stitch there, knitwise, pick up my yarn, wrap it around the knitting needle so I can begin knitting with it. So that was knit 1. Now we're going to knit a second stitch. And now I have to work a slip slip knit. So the way a slip slip knit works is I'm going to slip the first stitch on my left knitting needle over to my right knitting needle as if I'm knitting it. So I don't actually knit it. I'm just essentially twisting it. And now I'm going to slip one more stitch as if I'm knitting it from my left to right knitting needle. Now I want to take that left knitting needle point into the front base of both of those stitches at the same time, going from the left over towards the right. So to show it one more time, the front base going from left over towards the right. I'm going to wrap my yarn back behind, then up in between the 2 knitting needles, pull it through, then slide those 2 loops off of my left knitting needle. And that's a slip slip knit. I also want to mention another way that you can work that exact same slip slip knit that I do sometimes is I slip my first stitch knitwise for my left right knitting needle, slip my next stitch knitwise for my left right knitting needle. Now I'm just going to pass them both back over to my left knitting needle without untwisting them, and then I knit them together through the back loop. So that's actually doing the exact same thing as that other method I showed you for the slip slip knit. Now I'm going to continue knitting across the stitches. Turn my work. So now I'm looking at the right side of my work. And I'm going to knit across this row. So this is the right back decrease row 2. Just knitting. So now I'm going to continue working rows 3, 4, and 5, and then I'll come back and I'll work the cast off with you. And last up for the cast off, I'm going to cast off the exact same way as the other top. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, knit the next stitch, slip the previous stitch up, over, and off. Knit the next stitch, previous, up, over, and off, all the way across this top edge. For the last stitch, I'm going to slide into a bigger loop and then again cut my yarn, leaving a fairly long tail here. Thread that yarn tail through the remaining loop. For the front panels, our only calculations that we need to do are G and H. Everything else we've actually already calculated before. So first, starting off with G, G is the number of stitches we want to cast on for each one of those panels. So we're going to take our D, and D is actually something that we previously calculated for the back panel. So that was the total number of stitches we were casting on for the back panel. We're going to subtract off 4 and then divide it by 2. And now that's going to be the number we're casting on for each one of those front panels. And then we're going to calculate a length of a sweater before we start working decreases. So for H, we're going to take our A, which was the length of our sweater that we wanted, minus 9 inches. And that's going to give us the length of each one of those side panels to work before decreases begin. Now that we have all of our calculations done for the front 2 panels, I'm going to show you real quick what we'll be doing while knitting. So this one that you're looking at right here is the front right panel. And the way the panels are knit is we start down here at the bottom. We cast on using whatever color yarn you're going to be using for the ribbing. We work the 6 rows of ribbing, then we switch to our main color yarn. Next up, we just knit row after row of that main color fabric for that length H, and H is going to go from the bottom of the cast on edge of the ribbing all the way up through this main portion. So include the ribbing when you're measuring that H measurement. Then up here at the top, every sweater has the same length of decreases up here. So for everyone, regardless of the number of stitches you cast on or any of your calculations, this portion where it goes diagonal to create that neckline for the cardigan, that total height is 8 inches. Now in the pattern, you do subtract off 9. The reason you subtract off 9, but this is only 8, is because I allow for an extra 1 inch of stretch once you knit the final sweater and you start wearing it. The reason you can end up with that extra 1 inch of stretch is because the weight of the fabric can become a lot heavier than just your smaller gauge swatch. So that extra inch, I assume kind of the fabric's gonna pull down on itself just because there is a lot of yarn weight involved with the sweater. So let's get started with that cast on for the left panel over here on the other side. Now first up, I'm gonna start with my cast on, and I'm gonna cast on that G number of stitches using the same cast on method that I used for my back panel. Just gonna tie up my extra yarn here. And now I'm ready to begin my ribbing. So I'm gonna work a total of 6 rows of that knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. I just finished the ribbing, so now if you're working in the same color yarn, you don't have to cut your yarn, but I'm going to so I can switch colors. I'm just gonna leave a short tail here. Switch over to my main color yarn. And now I'm gonna continue just knitting row after row to create that garter stitch pattern until the total length, and as I mentioned, you want to include the ribbing in your total length measurement, measures that H number that you calculated. Another quick tip that I wanted to mention here as you're knitting up the front panels and also for the sleeves is that if your yarn tends to pool, and what I mean by pool is over here on the side swatch. So if I were to knit this yarn just as it is in a regular skein, the way the colors appear is I get a portion of green, then one stripe of brown, pink, brown, green, brown, pink, and there you can see the exact stripes. So that looks nice, but the only problem is the difference between the front and the back would then look very different because of the length of the rows. So on my back, my yarn didn't pool here, the whole back panel of the sweater. But if I were to knit the front or the sleeves the same exact way, just knitting up through one skein of yarn, it would pool. So what you can do to prevent pooling from happening is you can alternate skeins of yarn. So I'll link my video up in the top corner of the screen on how you can alternate skeins of yarn for flat knitting to prevent pooling if you're interested in it. If you don't mind the pooling, just continue knitting as you did for the back panel without worrying about alternating between skeins. So just to summarize one more time, essentially the back of my sweater using this colorway, the pooling didn't show up because the rows were so long that essentially there wasn't enough room for the colors to start gathering. Now when I switch it to being a narrower panel, so something like the front or the sleeve, my colors would start pooling. So it's things like the front panels and the sleeves where I chose to alternate skeins of yarn. I've now completed knitting and working up through that 8 inches of that front left panel. And what I'd recommend doing before you move on to working the decrease rows is count the number of rows that you have here and write that number down. That way, when you're knitting the front right panel, you can count up as you're knitting to make sure you have the exact same number of rows between the two. The way I count is I just count the number of bumps instead of number of rows. So I go up and count each set of bumps, write that number down. Next thing to mention here is you want to make sure you finished after a wrong side row. And the way you can tell the right side from the wrong side is down here at the bottom where the garter meets the ribbing. So this is the right side of my work, or the outside of my sweater. The wrong side that I just knit across has this extra bump up here. So I just worked across the wrong side, turned my work, and now I'm ready to begin working the decreases up here at the top. So for the front left panel, the way it's going to work is we're going to knit 2, work a decrease, then knit across the rest of the row. Then there's 3 rows after that where we just knit. So it's a 4-row repeat over and over again. So first up, I'm going to knit 2. Then I'm going to work a slip, slip, knit. Slip the first stitch, slip the second stitch, pass them back over to the left knitting needle, knit them together through the back loop. Now knit across the rest of the row. Now that I've worked that left front decrease row 1, I'm going to work the 3 rows of just knitting. So that was my first set of the decreases. Now I have to repeat those 4 rows a total of 7 times. Then I'm going to repeat just rows 1 and 2, so a decrease, then a knit, a total of 2 times. Once I complete all of that, I'll be ready to work the cast off, and the cast off method you're going to want to use is the exact same cast off method that you used for that back panel. Now real quick, I just wanted to mention the difference between the left and the right. So the left panel, we're trying to make our decreases basically tilt towards the left. And so every right side row where we're working a decrease, it's going to be the decrease at the beginning of a row. Now over here on the right panel, you'll be working your decreases also on a right side row, but now instead you're going to knit across until 4 stitches remain, work a knit 2 together, then knit the final 2 stitches. So left panel, decrease happens at the beginning of a row, right panel, decrease happens at the end of a row. And that's how we create kind of the opposite tilts that are happening here for the left and the right. Now once you finish your left and right panel, I'll come back and I'll show you the sleeves. The final set of calculations we have to do are the sleeves, and these ones are definitely the most involved just because there are a lot of different measurements going on here. So first, we're going to start at the top of the sleeve and figure out the number of stitches we want to cast on. So this is our L value, and this L is going to be our J measurement, right? So that's circumference around the top plus the 4 inches times 2.25, and then we're going to add on 2 to that. Now we want to take whatever our answer is, and we're going to round it up to the nearest number divisible by 2. So for example, when I calculate this out, I got a value of 35.75. That's not divisible by 2, so I'd round this up to 36 and then fill in 36 as my L value. The next one I have is going to be essentially the number of stitches we want to end up with at the bottom of our sleeve. So we're going to take our bottom circumference, or the circumference around the wrist, plus 2 inches, times 2.25, plus 2, and then again, you're going to want to round that answer up to the nearest number divisible by 2. So between this L and the M, we have the number of stitches we're going to start with and the number we want to end up with around the cuff. The next few calculations are all just trying to figure out essentially how many rows we need to decrease over. So first up, we're going to take our C value, which was that total length of the sleeve, minus B over 4, and our B, that was that circumference number where we took our bust circumference plus 6 inches, again divided by 4, minus 2. We're going to fill that in, and you want to round that answer up to the nearest whole number. For O, we're going to take the previous value that we just solved for, so that N, we're going to multiply it by 4.33, and then we're going to round that one up to the nearest whole number. P, we're taking our L and our M values, dividing it by 2. That will already come out as some sort of whole number. Now last up down here at the bottom, we're going to do O, which we've previously solved for, and P, which we've also previously solved for, and we're going to divide them. And we want to figure out when we divide them what the whole number is, so the number of full times it goes in is, and then what the remainder is. So to show that as an example, my O was 74, and then my P was 7. So when I divide these two, my whole number is 10. So 7 goes into 74 10 whole times. And then my remainder is 4. So my whole number, or that Q value, is going to be 10. And my R value is going to be 4. So anywhere it says Q in the pattern, I'm going to fill in 10. Anywhere it says R, I'm going to fill in 4.
Now before I actually begin knitting the sleeves, what I like to do is I like to make a little table or chart for each one of the sleeves where each row is a different box. That way as I'm knitting one sleeve, I can make sure it'll perfectly match the second sleeve. So what I'm going to start with here are a few of my inputs for the sleeve. So in the order that you need them, or the order that you calculated them, there's L, P, Q, and R. We cast on L stitches. We need to decrease every Qth row. We're going to work that decrease a total of P times, and then we have a remainder of R. And I've written out each one of my inputs for my calculations over here on the right side. Now the value I want to start with is this Q number. So we want to decrease every Qth row. So what I'm going to start by doing is on my piece of graph paper, I'm going to count from 1 all the way up until Q, going across a row. And just to label that, I counted up to Q. Now going down, I'm going to label 1 all the way up through P, right? So the total number of times I want to work that decrease. When I do this, I am going to offset it by 1 column here, just so I make sure I'll end up with like a nice box that I can draw in the middle. So off to the side, I'm going to go 1 up through P. And last up, what I'm going to do here to create my grid is I'm just going to draw 1 big rectangle and then each one of the individual lines for each column and row. Now the way this is going to work is each time I knit or work a decrease row, I'm going to mark off a box. And I'm going to start with this first box up here in the upper left corner. So my first row would be this first box here. Once I work it, I'm going to draw an X in it or a check mark, whatever you'd like. Then the next row will be this second box going across this top row. Third row, fourth row, fifth row. Keep on going all the way across. The 10th row for me, or my Qth row, this whole last column are going to be all of my decreases. So I'm just going to draw a D in each one of those. So I know, based on my numbers, I have to just work garter for 9 rows, then I have a decrease. Then I'd start the next row going across. So I'm going to knit 9 rows, then I'm going to work a decrease. And this way I'm just going to keep on marking off each box as I go across, then I'll start the next row, keep on marking off each box as I go across. Last thing I do also want to add in is I want to add in this R. So down here at the bottom we have whatever our remainder was, and I had 4. So I'm just going to add 4 extra boxes down here. There are no decreases there, right? I'm just knitting 4 rows. So that's my remainder down there in the bottom. So now, using this chart, I can knit each one of the sleeves. I'll draw it again for the second sleeve and make sure they're exactly the same. Now when I work a sleeve, I'm knitting from the top of the sleeve down to the cuff. So we're gonna start with that L number that we have. That's the number of stitches we're going to cast on, and you're going to want to cast that on out of the main fabric color. Now that I have my L number of stitches cast on, I first have to knit 9 rows, and then I'll be ready to work my first decrease row. So first I'll knit the 9, then I'll come back and I'll show you how I work a decrease row. And as I finish each row, I just mark them off in my table. Again, I start from the top, going from left over towards the right. Then once I finish this first row, then I'll go down to the next one, work from left to right. Just so I keep track of all the rows I've knit and all the ones I've decreased. I have now reached where I'm going to put in my first decrease row. And the way the decrease row works is first I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches. And now I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So that same decrease that we were using around the top neckline. So go into the next 2 stitches at the same time knitwise, wrap your yarn around, pull through, slide both stitches off. Then I'm going to continue knitting until 4 stitches remain. And now on the other side of the row, I'm going to work a slip, slip, knit. So slip the first stitch as if to knit, slip the next stitch as if to knit, pass them both back over to the left-hand knitting needle, then knit them together through the back loop. And lastly, knit the final 2 stitches. So now I've just worked that decrease, so I'm going to continue working through each one of my knit rows or decrease rows as described through all my calculations, all the way up through. And then once I'm finished all my regular knit rows and decreases, I'll be back to show you how to add in the ribbing. Now I finished going all the way up through the decreases for my one sleeve. And now what I'm going to do is once I finish the decreases, I'm going to add in my ribbing. So for the ribbing, it doesn't actually really matter if you have a right side or a wrong side to this sleeve, because up until now, both sides look essentially identical. What we're going to do is we're going to cut our yarn, and here I do leave a fairly long tail just in case I want to use it for seaming. So I'll probably leave almost about a yard here. And just tie that off to the side. If you are knitting everything in the same color, of course you don't have to cut your yarn. You can just keep on working in the same exact color. And I'm going to join in my cuff color. Now my ribbing here is going to be just like the ribbing on the front and back panels for this actual sweater. So I'm going to start off with a knit one, joining my new color yarn. Then I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, work a purl one, and keep on working yarn back
knit 1, yarn front, purl 1. I'm gonna work this ribbing row over and over again, a total of 6 times. Then once I'm done, I'll come back and I'll show you the cast off. Now that ribbing's complete, for the cast off, I'm actually going to use the exact same cast off that I used for all of the other panels. This cast off you will be able to see, and you do want to make sure you still have some stretch left in it, so you don't want to pull any of the stitches too tight. The reason for that is because this will be the end of your sleeve down here at the bottom, right? So you want to make sure it has plenty of stretch. So first up, I'm going to knit the first stitch, knit the second stitch, and now when I pass the previous stitch up, over, and off, I'm going to pull this other stitch that's still remaining on my right knitting needle just a little bit looser, make it a little bit larger. Then I'm going to go in and knit the next stitch, previous stitch, up, over, and off. And again, just make sure this stitch stays nice and loose. All the way across this top edge. I'm going to pull the final stitch larger, cut my yarn, and again here I do try to leave a bit of a longer tail, not too long here because I only have to seam up this small edge. And then thread my tail through that remaining stitch. And that is the cast off for the sleeve. Now I'm going to repeat all of these exact same steps again to work my second sleeve. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to seam these shoulders. So what I have laying out in front of me is I have the right side of all of my pieces facing upwards, wrong side down towards the floor. And I'm going to go across each one of these shoulders and seam it. So I had to switch cameras just so you could see all of the pieces at one time. Just to show you again, real quick, what I mean by the right side up is that if you have the contrast color for the ribbing, this is my right side. The wrong side is where that ribbing color comes up one row. So right side of all of the pieces facing upwards. And I'm gonna use a large tapestry needle. So these are my favorite sets. And I use the biggest size over here on the right-hand side to seam across. So I'll show one of these seams on the upper right-hand corner. Now you can technically start on either side with any one of these tails you have available. I prefer to seam from the right going over towards the left. So I'm going to take one of these yarn tails that I already have available and thread my tapestry needle. And now when I go across, I'm going to stretch it out a bit so I can see what's just below that cast on edge. And I typically try and pick up 2 of the loops just below the cast on edge on one side. Then I'm going to go back over to the other side. Again, pull back that cast off edge and pick up 2 of the loops on that side. And I'm going to alternate back over here, pick up 2 of the loops. And I don't pull it too tight at first. I actually wait until I've gotten over a few stitches. And then I'll pull it tight. So now that I've gone over, probably just over an inch there, I'll pull it tight, and that closes up the 2 sides. Then I'll keep on going for about another inch and pull it tight again. Okay, so now I finished seaming right across there. I'm just gonna leave my yarn tail as it is. I weave in them all at the very end. And now I'm gonna do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, so I've now seamed those shoulder seams together. And the next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go along and I'm gonna pick up the neckline stitches. So this is part of the reason you wanted such a long cord on your knitting needle, right? I'm gonna start down here at the bottom left corner. I'm gonna go all the way up around the neckline and then back down the other side. And I have to be able to hold all of those stitches on my knitting needle. So I have a 40-inch cord right now on my circular knitting needle. So I'm at the bottom corner of that left front panel, and I have my contrasting yarn. If you're knitting the collar band out of the same color, just leave it as is with the regular colorway. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take one of my knitting needle points and get it ready to pick up a stitch. So I start off down here in the ribbing, and what I'm looking for is, you can see this one, I did knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, going all the way across. So this first column along the edge is knit stitches. Then in here, the ones that are going upwards, those are my purl stitches. So what I'm gonna be doing is I'm gonna go into my work just in between that knit column and the purl column, and I'm gonna be knitting into each one of those gaps that forms. So I wanna start all the way down here at the bottom, as far down as I can get. So probably this one right here, and I'm gonna put my knitting needle into that hole. Now I'm gonna take my second knitting needle point, and I'm going to knit that stitch that I'm now creating. So I'm gonna take my new yarn, join it on here, and pull through. Now I'm gonna move up to the next opening, and I'm gonna knit through that opening. Then again, move up to the next one, knit through. And I'm gonna knit through each one of the openings in this bottommost ribbing. And then I'll just keep on going up for one more here into the main fabric portion and knit up to that next opening as well. Okay, so now I'm up to the main fabric and garter stitch up here at the top. So in this portion, I have a column of stitches along the side, and then I have, it's kind of like the first stitch is here, then the second stitch of every row is here. And it alternates between what looks like a knit stitch and what looks like a purl bump. Knit stitch, purl bump. That's the garter stitch appearance. So what I want to do is I want to pick up every other stitch or every other row going up this column. So the way I like to do it is I'm going to pick up the one that's right after each purl bump. So if I look at this first purl bump here, I'm going to put in my knitting needle right after it. A bunch of yarn tails happening here at the beginning of the round. So I'm going to try to just put those all to the side, then knit into that opening. Then I'm going to move up to the next purl bump, and I'm going to knit into the opening just beyond that. Go up to the next purl bump, knit into the opening just beyond that. And I'm going to keep on doing this all the way up along this edge. And you just want to make sure when you look at your work, it looks like everything's going in a straight line and you're picking up the same exact place all the way along the column of stitches. This little bit of stitches over here on the side, which is kind of like our edge stitches, that won't matter at all. That'll be tucked to the inside of the sweater, and we're going to knit that ribbing band so you won't actually ever see this edge. So I've continued doing every other row all the way up through the shoulder seam and then down the little portion of that back shaping. And now what I'm going to do is going across this back set of 16 stitches, I'm actually going to pick up each one of those 16 stitches. So every single stitch going all the way across. The way I do these ones is I just look for the top 2 loops, so kind of like those 2 loops on the outermost edge, put my left knitting needle through, and then knit through both of them. Then I'll move over to the next set of 2 loops, knit through both of them at the same time. Next set of 2. Sometimes they can be a little tight. Both at the same time. I'm just going to go all the way along this top edge, knitting through that cast off. And if yours are too tight, you also can do just one of the 2 loops and just pick up that as you go across. So now I've gone up the side, around the back, and now I'm going to go down the other side. And again, all through the little bit of the back, then all the way down the garter stitch. I'm going to pick up every other row, then down here at the ribbing portion, every single row. So I've now finished going all the way along the edge and picking up all those stitches. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. And I'm just going to turn my work so exactly where I just finished off. So I'm now looking at the inside of my sweater. Find my other knitting needle here. And you will have a lot of stitches on your knitting needle. Now, because I'm about to work across the inside of a row, and I like this first stitch to appear as a knit stitch on the outside, I'm actually going to start off with purl 1, knit 1 ribbing. So purl the first stitch, knit the next stitch. Purl 1, knit 1. And I'm going to keep on going all the way across. Now, as I'm finishing up across this row, I just want to make sure before I get all the way to the end of the row and I'm in this final ribbing portion that I will finish with a purl 1 stitch. So I just did purl 1, so next I have knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. So for me it worked out. If you ended up where your last stitch would be a knit stitch, what you can do is keep on working over until 1 stitch before the end, so kind of like 2 stitches in. And what you're going to do is you're actually just going to drop that stitch off your knitting needle and let it go. And what's going to happen is it's going to be taken into this next one over. Now, I don't actually want to drop it, so I'm going to leave it there and just work that final stitch in the purl 1. So that's only if you were going to end up with a knit stitch, you want to end up with a purl stitch. And you won't notice at all if you do end up removing one of those stitches in the knitting portion. We almost pick up like extra stitches there, so it's okay to lose one if you need to make it odd. Okay, so that was our first row. Now we're going to turn our work and we're going to work across the next row. I'm going to start now with knit 1, purl 1 and go all the way across, knit 1, purl 1, and my final stitch on the other side should be a knit stitch. Now I finished that second row and I'm ready to start adding in my buttonholes. So the way this works is first up we have to do a few calculations. Now the final set of calculations we have to do for this sweater are to create the buttonhole. So first what we're going to do is we're going to count the number of stitches we have picked up along the edge, and we want to count along the straight portion of the sweater. So what that means is you want to start at the bottom where your ribbing begins, and you want to go up until your decreases begin for your neck. So count how many stitches you have in that straightaway portion of the sweater, just on one side. That number of stitches is going to be our S value. Now you do also want to round it down to the nearest number divisible by 4. So let's say you had 42 stitches, you would round that down to 40 and put your 40 value as your S. Next up, we're going to calculate the number of stitches we're going to need between buttonholes. We're going to have 4 buttonholes total. So we're going to take our S, our previous number we just calculated or counted, and we're going to divide it by 4 and write that value on our second line as our T. Last up, you're going to do T divided by 2. This tells us essentially how many stitches we're going to have before putting in our first buttonhole. You just want to keep the whole number portion and ignore the remainder. So let's say your T started out at 9. 9 over 2 would give me 4.5. I'm just going to keep that 4 portion, and that's what I'd write on my line. I ignore that 0.5 part. Now that we've done those calculations, I'm ready to begin working and adding in those buttonholes. So first up, the first number of stitches for me is 4. So I'm going to work in pattern the first 4 stitches. So my row has a purl bump first because I'm on the inside of my work. So I'm going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. So continue working for whatever number of stitches you need to in pattern, then stop. And now we're ready to cast off 1 stitch to add in the buttonhole. The way we're going to do this, and it doesn't matter what type of stitch your next stitch is, you're always going to knit it. So you're going to knit the next stitch, then work in pattern the stitch after that. So for me, the next stitch is a knit stitch. If it were a purl stitch, you could purl it. And now I'm going to take the previous stitch and slide it up, over, and off. So the stitch I just cast off is first I have 4, then I cast off 1, and now I've already worked one of the stitches in my next portion. So for me, I have 7 stitches that I need to work total in between casting off the buttonholes. So this is the first of 7. Now I'm going to keep on working in pattern the rest of the 7. So next up I have a purl 1. And now again, I'm going to add in my next buttonhole. I'm going to knit the next stitch, remember regardless of what type of stitch it is. Work the next stitch in pattern. For me it's a knit. Then slide the previous stitch up, over, and off. So I've just added in a buttonhole in between these 2. So now I have the first stitch worked. I'm going to work all the way up until my next buttonhole again. And I'm going to keep on repeating this until I've added in the correct number of buttonholes. And now once I've added in my final buttonhole, I'm just going to continue working across the rest of the row in pattern. Now that we've cast off for where the buttonholes are going to go, in this next row what we have to do is work in pattern all the way back across until where the buttonholes start, and then in each one of those locations where we cast off a stitch, we're going to cast back on a stitch. So first I'm going to work in pattern, so just knit 1, purl 1 all the way across until I reach where that first location is where I cast off a stitch for a button. Now I'm over to my first location that I need to cast on a new stitch. So there's a few options for how you can do this. First up, I'm going to move my yarn to the back. First option is you can grab onto the yarn with your left hand, point your pointer finger, then go down below, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. Then slide that topmost loop onto your right knitting needle and just slide it completely off your left hand. So that cast on 1 stitch. A different option for how you can do this is take your yarn in your left hand, twist it towards the right, so it's twisted just like this, and then slide that right onto your knitting needle, pull it snug. So both of those are doing the exact same thing. So now let me work in pattern across until where my next buttonhole is. Now again, my yarn is in the back and I can either twist it towards the right, so my yarn is looped just like that, slide it on, or with my left hand, grab onto the yarn, pointer finger down below to the bottom, up to the top, down below to the bottom again, slide it off my left hand onto the knitting needle. Oops, split it a bit there. There we go. And I'm just going to keep on casting on in my last two locations. Now that I finished casting on those stitches, I'm just going to work one more ribbing row in pattern. So anywhere that I just cast on a stitch, I'm just going to work it as whatever it should be in the knit one, purl one pattern. So here I have purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one. Then I have the stitch I cast on, so that will be worked as a purl stitch. Then I have knit one, purl one, and it keeps on going. So just make whatever those ones you cast on just fit right into your pattern. And last up, the final row that we're going to do here is going to be the cast off. And you can do any sort of cast off you'd like for this. I like to cast off in pattern. So what I mean by that is I'm going to knit the first stitch because it appears as a knit stitch. Then rather than knitting the second stitch and passing the previous one up, over, and off, this one is a purl stitch. So I'm going to purl this stitch, then pass the previous up, over, and off. Now the next stitch is a knit stitch. So I'm going to knit it, take the previous up, over, and off. The next is a purl. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, purl it, previous one, up, over, and off. So whenever I'm working the next stitch, I'm just working it as whatever type of stitch it was in the ribbing pattern. Next up, I'm going to work on sewing on the sleeves to either side. So you can start on either side here. And what I'm using here are some of these little stitch markers that open and close. And in this case, I'm not actually going to use it as a stitch marker. Instead, I'm going to use it to pin the two sides of my fabric together. So what I'm going to start by doing is folding my sleeve in half, finding the center point, and now I want to line that center point up with my shoulder seam. Now that I have that lined up, I'm going to pin this side of my sleeve down here. And I want to make sure it goes the same number of rows on either side. So from my shoulder seam, which is right in here, I'm going to count down the number of sets of bumps. And now, using that number, I'm going to count the other direction. So that is my spot on the other side. So I'm going to pin the other corner here. And now I have the two spots that I want my sleeve to go to. So I'm going to use my tapestry needle, and I'm going to try and use some of the yarn that's already attached to the sleeve. So probably one of these two ends here. And I'm going to start seaming the two together. As I'm seaming together, I want to pick up one stitch in from the side over here. And you can do either the ones that are on the kind of like the back knit row or the front purl bumps. All the way along here, just make sure you're one stitch in. And then along this edge, I just try and pick up the bottommost set of loops from any one of these stitches. And they won't line up perfectly because this one, of course, these are all different stitches and these are rows. So not a perfect one-to-one gauge. So you just have to make sure as you're going along that you're staying in place and keeping everything lined up. So you may have to skip a stitch on this side or skip a row on this side. Now I've sewn on both of these sleeve panels. So the last thing I have to do is now I'm going to seam up the side of the sweater and then down the sleeve on both of the sides. So the way I do this is I can start on either one really. Sometimes I switch back and forth, but I just lay it flat and then fold in both sides. start seaming up until the armpit. Then I'll start seaming the opposite direction up until the armpit as well. And again, I'm just going one stitch in from either side. Once I finish seaming up both of the sides and arms, the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go through the sweater and weave in all the ends. So you can see I have a bunch here. The easiest place to weave them into is these actual like seams that you've created. So I typically take a tapestry needle and just weave them a little ways through each one of these seams, then cut the yarn. Now the final few steps I do to complete my sweater are: first, I soak my sweater after I've woven in all the ends in a bucket of lukewarm water with some gentle soap. And once it's been in there for about 20 minutes or so, I gently squeeze the excess water out of it. Then I roll it up in a towel to get more of that excess water out. And then lastly, I lay it flat to dry. So I always lay it flat, I never hang it up. You don't want to hang it up because then it'll essentially stretch the sweater out. So lay it flat. I like to use either some of those foam drying mats or, as I've shown here, a clothes drying rack. Once it's dry, I'm going to go ahead and sew on the buttons. The buttons I used for this project are Lamode buttons that I purchased from Joann Fabrics. These ones are 1 1/8 inch in diameter. I'd recommend getting either 1 1/8 inches all the way up to 1.5 inches in diameter for the size of the buttonholes we created.
I hope you've enjoyed this knitting tutorial today where we made our own custom sweater. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And also, as I mentioned at the start of this video, if there's any future tutorials you'd like to see, please leave those in the comments down below as well. I'll see you next time.